There was, in the village of Willowbrook, a settled belief that nothing truly dreadful could happen on a Saturday afternoon in June. The roses were out in the cottage gardens. White curtains moved softly at open windows. Bees drifted lazily above the lavender hedges, and from the church meadow came the cheerful confusion of village festivity. Children shouting, crockery clinking, and the occasional stern instruction from the vicar's wife regarding the proper arrangement of sponge cakes. Willowbrook lay some miles from Market Basing and possessed the sort of peace that strangers found charming and inhabitants considered entirely natural. It was the kind of village where one knew precisely who quarrelled with whom, whose maid was unreliable, and which families had once been quite grand before unfortunate investments or unfortunate marriages diminished them. Miss Jane Marple, seated beneath a striped canvas awning beside the tea-table, observed the proceedings with mild blue eyes and an expression of complete harmlessness. She knitted. It was one of Miss Marple's useful habits that people spoke freely in front of her. Elderly ladies engaged in knitting merged very easily into the background of English village life. One no more guarded one's tongue before Miss Marple than before the aspidistra in the drawing-room window. 3 sugars, Major?" asked Mrs. Finch pleasantly. Major Harold Finch, retired from the Indian Army and perpetually sunburnt, grunted. "Doctor says I must be careful." "You told me yesterday," remarked his wife, "that doctors are all fools." "That," said the Major, "is entirely different." Miss Marple smiled faintly. The fête had been arranged in aid of repairs to the church roof, which had suffered during the spring storms. Stalls lined the meadow. Preserves, books, white elephants, homemade soaps, and an ambitious fortune-telling tent run by the curate's niece from Cheltenham. Near the bowling game stood Mr. Edwin Palfrey, chairman of the parish council and owner of Willowbrook Hall. He was speaking loudly, as such men often do when they wish to appear jovial. "A splendid turnout, splendid. Exactly the spirit the village needs." Mr. Palfrey was a large man with silver hair and an imposing waistcoat. He had the polished appearance of prosperity and the habit of patting people on the shoulder while speaking to them. Miss Marple watched him thoughtfully. Not, perhaps, a naturally kind man, she reflected, though exceedingly practised in the appearance of kindness. Beside him stood his young wife, Sylvia Palfrey. Sylvia was perhaps 32, graceful and fair-haired, with a delicacy that suggested fragility without actually possessing it. She laughed at the appropriate moments, but her eyes wandered often toward the edge of the meadow, where the old theatre pavilion stood beyond the trees. The pavilion had once belonged to travelling players many decades earlier, and was now rarely used except for storage. A faded red curtain still hung within its little stage, though damp and age had nearly ruined it. This afternoon, however, it was to house the amateur dramatic recital arranged by Mrs. Dane from the Women's Institute. "There she goes again," murmured Mrs. Finch under her breath. Miss Marple glanced up mildly. "My dear?" Mrs. Finch leaned closer. "Looking toward the pavilion. Sylvia Palfrey has done it all afternoon." Miss Marple said nothing. Village gossip, she knew, was rather like fishing with a fine net. One caught much that was useless, but occasionally something important drifted in. "You don't suppose," continued Mrs. Finch eagerly, "that she's meeting someone?" "My dear Mrs. Finch," said Miss Marple gently, "young wives very often look distracted. Marriage can be an exhausting occupation." Mrs. Finch blinked uncertainly, unable to decide whether she had been rebuked. A bell rang near the church gate. The recital was beginning. People drifted toward the pavilion in cheerful disorder. Folding chairs scraped across wooden boards. Children were shushed repeatedly. Somewhere nearby a dog barked with conviction. Miss Marple rose slowly. "Shall we go in?" asked Mrs. Finch. "In a moment," said Miss Marple. "Crowds move rather more safely once the eager people have gone ahead." This was perfectly true, though not her only reason. She had observed just a minute earlier a curious little incident. A young man had emerged from the side entrance of the pavilion carrying what appeared to be a length of electrical wire. He was pale, nervous-looking, and dressed in an ill-fitting brown coat despite the warmth of the day. As he passed Sylvia Palfrey, their eyes met very briefly. Then he disappeared behind the tents. Interesting, thought Miss Marple. Very interesting indeed. Inside the pavilion the air smelled faintly of dust, damp wood, and old velvet. The recital platform stood beneath the faded curtain. A piano had been wheeled in for accompaniment, and rows of chairs faced the little stage. Villagers fanned themselves with programs while Mrs. Dane fluttered anxiously near the front. Miss Marple seated herself near the back. She preferred observing people from behind. One saw more that way. Mr. Edwin Palfrey occupied the front row beside his wife. Across the aisle sat Dr. Leonard Bryce, the village physician, lean and dark-faced, with an expression that managed somehow to be both tired and impatient. Near him was Clara Vane, the schoolmistress. Clara was a capable woman of 40 with sharp features and unusually intelligent eyes. There had once been rumors years ago connecting her name with Edwin Palfrey before his marriage to Sylvia. Villagers remembered everything. Mrs. Dane stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, we shall begin with a dramatic reading from Hamlet performed by members of our own community." Polite applause followed. The curtain stirred slightly. Miss Marple noticed Sylvia Palfrey stiffen. Then the performance began. It was not, Miss Marple thought charitably, an overwhelming artistic success. The curate spoke far too loudly. Mrs. Dane forgot several lines. Young Timothy Red, playing Hamlet, possessed a distressing tendency to wave his arms at emotional moments. Still, the audience enjoyed itself. Laughter came in the proper places. Then, just as Timothy Red declaimed, "Speak, I am bound to hear," a voice sounded from behind the curtain. A man's voice. Terrified. "No, keep away from me." The audience laughed uncertainly at first, supposing it part of the performance. Then came a heavy crashing sound, and a scream. Real screams are unmistakable. They tear through ordinary life with a kind of dreadful honesty. Mrs. Dane dropped her script. Someone stood abruptly, overturning a chair. Dr. Bryce moved at once toward the stage. The curtain was pulled aside. For one long second nobody moved. Then chaos began. Mr. Edwin Palfrey lay sprawled behind the curtain upon the wooden boards. A narrow knife protruded from his chest. Sylvia Palfrey gave a choking cry and collapsed against the front row. Women gasped. Someone began praying aloud in a trembling voice. Dr. Bryce knelt beside the body. His face changed almost immediately. "He's gone," he said shortly. Silence spread outward through the pavilion. Miss Marple remained seated. Her old hands rested quietly upon her handbag, but her eyes moved carefully from face to face. Curiosity, and something else. Not grief, she thought. Not in everyone. Dr. Bryce rose. "No one must leave," he announced sharply, "until the police arrive." At that moment Clara Vane spoke suddenly from near the aisle. But who was the voice? Everyone turned toward her. "The voice behind the curtain," she said. "The man who cried out." A murmur spread immediately. "Yes, I heard it too. There was definitely someone there. But where's he gone?" The little pavilion seemed to shrink inward with collective unease. Dr. Bryce pulled back the curtain fully. There was nowhere obvious to hide. Only stacked scenery, ropes, dusty trunks, and the rear exit door standing slightly ajar. Major Finch muttered, "Good Lord." Then Sylvia Palfrey spoke. Her voice was low and strained. "There was someone," she whispered. "I know there was." Miss Marple looked at her steadily, and suddenly noticed something extraordinarily curious. Sylvia's gloves, pale cream kid gloves suitable for a fête, were stained faintly with green paint near the fingertips. Fresh paint. Miss Marple's gaze drifted thoughtfully toward the old stage scenery stacked beside the curtain. Green paint. Quite fresh. Outside, somewhere beyond the pavilion, a rook cried harshly above the trees. And in Willowbrook, where dreadful things were never supposed to happen, murder had arrived quietly among the teacups and summer roses. By 6 o'clock that evening there was scarcely a soul in Willowbrook who had not heard at least 3 different versions of the murder. The village possessed, as Miss Marple often reflected, an extraordinary talent for enlarging facts while shrinking accuracy. According to Mrs. Bellamy at the post office, Edwin Palfrey had been shot by a jealous husband. According to the butcher's assistant, he had uncovered a ring of smugglers operating somewhere near the river. Young Tommy Pike informed everyone confidently that the killer had escaped through a secret tunnel beneath the pavilion stage. By supper-time the tunnel had acquired German spies. Miss Marple listened to these developments with polite attention while taking tea in her cottage sitting-room. Her cottage stood near the church lane, modest and old-fashioned, with bowls of roses upon the tables and the comforting smell of lavender polish lingering faintly in the air. Outside, evening sunlight rested softly upon the hollyhocks. Inside, Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair while her friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, paced excitedly before the fireplace. "It's exactly the sort of thing one reads about in the newspapers," declared Dolly. "Only much nastier when it happens close to home." Mrs. Bantry was a handsome woman with brisk manners and a tendency toward dramatic conclusions. She had arrived scarcely 20 minutes earlier, and had already repeated the entire afternoon 3 times. And Sylvia fainting exactly like that. Dolly continued, "Though personally I thought it looked rather theatrical." "My dear," said Miss Marple mildly, "young women do sometimes faint when their husbands are murdered before them." "Yes, yes, of course." Dolly lowered herself into a chair. "There's something very odd about the whole business." Miss Marple threaded another stitch carefully. "Yes," she agreed. "Very odd indeed." A clock ticked quietly between them. At length Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "You noticed something, didn't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One notices many little things." "That means yes." Miss Marple did not immediately answer. In truth, her mind had been occupied all afternoon by several small details which, taken separately, might have meant nothing at all. Together, however, she remembered the frightened voice behind the curtain. "No, keep away from me." It had not sounded like Edwin Palfrey. She felt almost certain of it. And then there were Sylvia's gloves stained with green paint. Fresh green paint precisely matching the scenery boards stacked backstage. Curious, very curious. "What do the police think?" asked Dolly eagerly. "Inspector Graves appears convinced that the crime was committed impulsively." "The local inspector?" Dolly sniffed. "That man arrested my gardener once for stealing chickens. Turned out the foxes had taken them." "Foxes can be remarkably misleading," observed Miss Marple. A knock sounded at the cottage door. Florence, Miss Marple's maid, entered carrying a visiting card upon a tray. "For you, miss." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "Inspector Graves." Dolly sat up instantly. "Ah, splendid." Inspector Graves entered with the air of a man already burdened beyond endurance. He was stout, serious, and perspiring slightly from the warm evening. His boots carried traces of meadow mud, and his collar appeared uncomfortably tight. "Miss Marple." "Inspector, won't you sit down?" He accepted tea gratefully. "Most unpleasant business," he muttered. "Yeah." Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "I understand you were present throughout the affair." "So were a great many people," said Miss Marple gently. "Yes, naturally. Still, Colonel Melchette once mentioned that you possess a certain AA interest in criminal matters." Miss Marple smiled. "Only human nature, Inspector." He nodded vaguely, clearly uncertain what this meant. "Well, we've made considerable progress already." "Indeed?" "We have a suspect." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward so abruptly that her teacup rattled. "Already?" Inspector Graves permitted himself a satisfied expression. "The young fellow seen near the pavilion. Arthur Tate." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. "The man in the brown coat? You noticed him?" "Oh, yes. He worked occasionally at the Hall doing electrical repairs." Witnesses observed him entering the pavilion shortly before the murder. Afterward he disappeared. "That does sound unfortunate for him," murmured Miss Marple. "More than unfortunate. We found blood upon his sleeve." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "There now!" Inspector Graves warmed to his subject. "Furthermore, Palfrey dismissed the man last month following accusations of theft." "Did he indeed?" "A clear motive." Miss Marple resumed knitting. "Possibly." The inspector glanced at her. "You disagree?" "My dear Inspector, I merely think people are very seldom as simple as motives make them appear." He frowned. "The facts are straightforward enough." Miss Marple said nothing. Straightforward facts had a distressing tendency to become complicated later. Inspector Graves continued. "We've sent officers searching the woods and lane roads. Tate cannot have gone far." "Did anyone actually see him commit the murder?" asked Miss Marple. "Numero." "But the evidence?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "The evidence." She looked thoughtfully into the fire. There had been fear in Arthur Tate's face earlier that afternoon, but not, she thought, the fear of a man preparing to kill. Rather the fear of someone already trapped. Inspector Graves finished his tea. "One more thing. Several witnesses reported hearing a voice behind the curtain before the body was discovered. We believe it was Tate." Miss Marple's eyes lifted slowly. "Do you?" "Certainly. The fellow was startled during the attack." Miss Marple considered. "No," she said quietly. The inspector blinked. "No? I do not think the voice belonged to Arthur Tate." A brief silence followed. Inspector Graves looked faintly irritated. "On what grounds?" "My memory." "That's hardly evidence." "No," agreed Miss Marple. "But memory is often useful." The inspector rose stiffly. "Well, we shall know more once Tate is found." After he departed, Dolly Bantry exploded immediately. "You don't think the young man did it?" Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. "I think," she said, "that someone wished very much for Arthur Tate to appear guilty. Then whose voice was it?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Outside, dusk deepened softly over Willowbrook. Somewhere down the lane a gate clicked shut. The village, outwardly peaceful once more, seemed wrapped in that peculiar stillness which follows violent events. At last Miss Marple spoke. "The voice behind the curtain," she said slowly, "was frightened before Edwin Palfrey died." Dolly stared. "Well, naturally." "But that," said Miss Marple quietly, "is precisely the difficulty." At Willowbrook Hall, Sylvia Palfrey sat alone in the drawing-room with untouched coffee cooling beside her. The great house felt oppressive after dark. Portraits watched from shadowed walls. The clocks ticked too loudly. Even the servants moved in whispers, as though afraid sound itself might disturb something dreadful lingering in the corridors. Sylvia pressed trembling fingers against her temples. A log shifted suddenly in the grate. She flinched violently. Then she laughed at herself under her breath. Nonsense! Yet fear remained, not grief alone. Her gaze drifted toward the French windows overlooking the terrace. Beyond them lay darkness and the faint silver outlines of the gardens. And somewhere out there, perhaps hidden among the trees beyond the lawns, was a man who knew the truth, a man who had heard the voice behind the curtain. Sylvia closed her eyes. She could still hear it clearly. "No keep away from me." Not Edwin's voice. Never Edwin's. A sharp knock sounded at the drawing-room door. Sylvia started. "Yes?" The butler entered uneasily. "Beg pardon, madam, but there's someone asking to see you." "At this hour?" "Yes, madam." "Who is it?" The butler hesitated. "A Miss Clara Vane." For the first time that evening, genuine alarm crossed Sylvia Palfrey's face. Clara Vane entered the drawing-room of Willowbrook Hall with the composed manner of a woman determined not to betray emotion. She removed her gloves carefully before speaking. "I hope I'm not intruding." Sylvia Palfrey remained standing beside the fireplace. The light from the shaded lamps softened her fair hair, but did nothing to lessen the strain visible in her face. "It's rather late for a visit, Miss Vane." "Yes," said Clara quietly. "I thought it better not to wait until morning." For a moment neither woman spoke. The room itself seemed to listen. Beyond the French windows the terrace lay pale beneath moonlight, and farther still the gardens dissolved into blackness, where the yew hedges stood like silent watchers. At last Sylvia said sharply, "What do you want?" Clara looked at her steadily. "I want to know whether you intend telling the truth." A flicker crossed Sylvia's face. "I don't know what you mean." "Then I shall speak plainly." Clara placed her gloves upon the table with deliberate neatness. "You recognize the voice behind the curtain." Sylvia's hand tightened upon the mantelpiece. "No." "You did." "You're mistaken." Clara's expression did not alter. "For years," she said, "Edwin frightened people into silence. Servants. Anyone who threatened his reputation. But this afternoon someone finally turned against him. That's absurd." "Is it?" Sylvia turned away abruptly. "I won't discuss this tonight." "You must." The schoolmistress's calmness carried more force than shouting might have done. Sylvia wheeled around. "And why exactly should I speak to you?" For the first time emotion entered Clara Vane's voice. "Because if you remain silent, the wrong person may hang." The word seemed to strike the room like a physical thing.